few weeks ago, I was picking on Justin. I read the fear and trembling verse and said about it being his favorite verse because it seems like it might be. You bring it up a lot. But last week, he spoke on one of my favorite verses, but it's not one that I'd care to admit is a favorite. Do you guys have favorite verses? Anybody? Got one that is your verse? I'd say at most churches, the favorite verses would be the ones that Hobby Lobby puts on a sign in a swirly font. You know, stuff about rising on wings of eagles and supernatural comfort and doing all things through Christ and, all that really motivational stuff. But our church is kind of weird, so we've got people that favor verses that mention fear and trembling and meaningless pursuits and stuff like that. So I don't feel as bad to say that one of my favorite verses is Mark 9:24, when a father says, "I do believe, help my unbelief." Not really something you'd want to hang on the wall, is it? Like, can you imagine walking to my house and that's on the wall? You'd be like, boy, Brenneman, get it together, Don't hang that out there, that's ugly. That's not something, you'd put out. But I could hang it on the wall. Because like the man who spoke those words, I too often find myself in that position. I believe, but help my unbelief. Justin did a great job getting into that last week. How it can be so hard to read verses that say if we have faith as small as a mustard seed, we can move mountains. And yet, we seem to struggle to have faith to do things that would be much, much smaller in our eyes. What's that say about us? What's that say about our faith? What's that say about the cubic inches to faith conversion ratio? Must be pretty potent stuff, huh? If a mustard seed could move a mountain. These are all questions that can make us think. Justin used the word spiderweb. Make our minds just spiderweb out. Lead to worry. But we don't have to. And if you missed why, go back on YouTube or Facebook and watch Justin's sermon. He wrapped it up well. I don't want to go back to the same topic this morning, but I do want to go back to the same passage and maybe pull a couple other aspects out that I think would be worth the time to look into. We're going to read that scripture again, but first a little backstory. Before we get to this Father and the Son that has a spirit, Peter, James, and John had gone up a mountain with Jesus, and they had witnessed what we now call the Transfiguration. This is when Jesus became glorious, and his clothes, it says, were bleached whiter than any man could bleach. And then Elijah and Moses showed up, and they were all there, and the disciples, they were like, wow, this is awesome. It's good. One of them said, it's good for us to be here. And they wanted to build structures and shelters, and they just wanted to camp out and live in this presence of God glorified. And who wouldn't? They got a little taste of God in all his glory. A big booming voice came from heaven and spoke and said, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Obviously, Peter, James, and John were super excited to have witnessed this. Jesus told them, don't say anything until the Son of Man rises again. And they had no idea what that meant. They didn't know. Then they headed back down the mountain to meet the other disciples. By this time, the disciples had been actively ministering alongside Jesus, both with him and out. You remember, he sent them out, and they were able to cast out demons. They were able to anoint with oil and heal the sick. So they had experience with miracles. You can read about those in Mark 6. So Peter, James, John, and Jesus come down, roll up on the other disciples, and this is what they find. Mark 9:14. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" Jesus asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." So check out that first part. It says there was a large crowd, and the teachers of the law were there arguing with the disciples. Jesus said, "What's going on?" The man in the crowd says, "I came to see you. I brought my son to you. But since you were gone, I asked your disciples to heal him." Did you catch that? The man said he came to see Jesus. I brought my son to you. But Jesus was up the mountain, so disciples will have to do. And they couldn't do anything about it. They were unable to heal him. What does that say about the disciples? They were unable to heal him. In the light of this failed exorcism, the scribes, the teachers of the law, were arguing with the disciples. I think when the man came up and asked the disciples if they could cast that spirit out, I think they said they could, because they had been able to. But then they weren't able to. And I think that's why the argument. I think the scribes, the teachers of the law, the crowd were like, whoa, what are you guys talking about? You said you could heal him. He's not healed. It had worked in the past, but when it didn't work, it called into question what they said they could do, what they said they believed, and even the ministry and power of Jesus. These things were now up for debate because it didn't work. Failure makes it pretty easy to be skeptical of someone's claims, doesn't it? Here these guys are saying, we can do these things in Jesus' name, and then they don't. What does that say about the disciples? What does that say about Jesus? Well, Jesus wasn't going to let that question go unanswered. He says in verse 19, "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." Now, I've often thought the unbelieving generation, when he's kind of chastising them, rebuking them, I often thought that was the disciples that he was talking to. But I don't think it is. I read a whole bunch of commentaries, and the commentaries also don't think it is. They say that Jesus used that word generation 5 times in Mark, and in no other time was it referring to the disciples. What they think it's referring to is the crowd, the rest of the people. It appears that Jesus is addressing the crowd at large and not the disciples who couldn't cast out the demon. What he's getting on is the unbelief of the crowd, not the inability or the failure of his disciples. I pulled a lot from the one commentary that I read. It's the Pillar New Testament commentary on the book of Mark. And so some of the things that I'm putting out here this morning are quotes from that. It said, inability is simply a limitation, not a fault. Because they were unable, that wasn't why Jesus was upset here. He was upset with the unbelief of the crowd. When you look at things at this point, survey the scene. The crosshairs are on the validity of the ministry of the disciples and the validity of the ministry of Jesus. Is Jesus who he says he is? If these disciples are following him and they can't do it, if they didn't pull off what they say they can do, is this even real? I asked the question a minute ago, what does this failure say about the disciples? What does it say about Jesus? I think Jesus' rebuke gives us a more important question. What does it say about the crowd? What does the failure say about the crowd? What does the failure say about the dad? Fortunately for us, the doubts and disbelief of the public do not limit Jesus. Verse 20, so they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Again, we can see doubts creeping in for the man. It almost reads to me like he's trying to let Jesus off the hook. Like the first attempt didn't work. So instead of saying, like, Jesus, you heal him with faith and confidence, he's like, if you can do anything, show us compassion, help us. He's given Jesus a way out so that nobody has to be embarrassed again, that this isn't going to work. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. I can so empathize with this guy. He knows there's no other way for his son to be healed. His son was born this way. It's always been this way. He's got nothing. The doctors can't help. This is what it is. Here Jesus said, everything is possible for one who believes. I think you could also read that, everything is possible for one who has faith. I think this guy knows somehow that belief, faith, is the only thing he needs, and it's the only thing that's going to work. But when he looks inside of himself, it doesn't look like he has enough, or it's not the right kind, or it's not strong enough, all the stuff Justin was talking about last week. He believes that if he had faith, his son would be healed. But he doesn't think he believes enough. He doesn't think he has enough faith. Anyone ever been there? Like, I know if I had enough faith, God could, but I can't. I can't have enough faith. I just don't. I want to, but I don't. The commentary said something that comforted me, and I want to read it. It said, true faith is always aware how small and inadequate it is. The father becomes a believer, not when he amasses a sufficient quantum of faith, but when he risks everything on what little faith he has. When he yields his insufficiency to the true sufficiency of Jesus. I do believe. Help my unbelief. I think you could say it all came together for that man in that moment. I don't know what his mindset was when he approached the disciples, but I could see it being something more akin to curiosity or playing the lottery and hope he wins. You know, more blind hope than blind faith. But then this man was confronted with the realization that not only would he have to have faith, but to him it didn't look like he had very much. Here's the thing though, Jesus will never ask more than you have. He'll never ask you to give more than you have, just all you have. He will ask for all of it, but not more than that. So what this man needed was to hang everything on that tiny shred of faith that he had. And in that moment, understand what it is to have faith. Would it be faith if it seemed like a sure thing? Would it be faith if a double-blind study had confirmed that this would work and all the results were published in a peer-reviewed medical journal? Would it be faith if he had 100% confidence? Or is it faith when you say, God, this is all the faith I have. It's not enough, but it's all I have, and I've put it in you. True faith isn't confident in itself. It knows it's not enough. In the same way, true faith doesn't judge Jesus or his ability by the inability or the failure of his followers. It hurts me when I see people lose their faith over the failure of believers, over the failures of the church. Remember, the man said when he came to see Jesus. What he found were Jesus' followers. A lot of parallels to today. All he found was disciples who couldn't when he was looking for God who could. The crowd was also skeptical of Jesus because of the disciples' inability. I think it's safe to say that many in the world today view Jesus in the light of the church, view Jesus in the light of what his believers do or don't do well enough. Doesn't always paint a great picture for Jesus, does it? And that's why we've been talking about sanctification. That's why it's so important. The more we're like Christ, the more we'll be like Christ, and the more they'll understand who Christ is. But right along with that, we have to be the first to say, we're not enough. We haven't arrived. This is a process for me, just like it will be a process for you. Don't judge God based on me. Don't judge Jesus' faithfulness based on mine. Don't judge his strength or his power or his compassion, grace, mercy, love, any of that on a believer or on the church. It will never be the same. True faith isn't confident in itself, and it's not swayed by the failures of other believers or the skepticism and lack of faith of the crowd at large. Commentary again said, true faith is unconditional openness to God, a decision in the face of all to the contrary that Jesus is able. Verse 25, when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said he's dead. Put yourself in Dad's shoes now. The next verse is the next verse in the Bible. But there was time for people to look on this scene, look at the boy on the ground and say, that boy's dead. That boy didn't make it. Can you imagine being the dad? Every millisecond of staring at your son on the ground, looking like a corpse, hearing the crowd behind you, that boy's dead. He didn't make it. That killed him. Can you imagine? It had to be one of those times where everything slows down and you can think all the thoughts at once. Do you guys have that? That moment of, like, it's for me, it's only when things are really terrible and it's overwhelming, but it's like everything slows down and you feel like you're running 30 different thoughts at the same time. I imagine running through his brain, it was, what have I done? Was this a mistake? Did my asking Jesus to help kill my son? Was that the exchange? It's a good reminder that even when Jesus is working on our lives, making things better, it might not look like that on the outside. It might not feel like that on the outside. In fact, the moment when we place our faith in Jesus might immediately make us question whether that was a good idea or not. The crowd thinks it's worse. If I'm looking with my own eyes, I think it's worse. Why did I do this? This was a mistake. Your own senses might tell you it was a mistake. Those around you might point at your situation and say, man, you're just as bad. You might be worse off. What are you doing? I had to think of Jesus leading Moses and the Israelites out of slavery to the promised land, but through a desert for 40 years. Sometimes things get worse before they get better. Sometimes our lives in Jesus' plan, in God's plan for our lives to be sanctified, to be more like him, sometimes it feels worse. Sometimes it looks worse before it gets better. Verse 27, but Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, this kind can only come out by prayer. One more thing I think we can learn from this passage is that our faith ultimately must be in God and in what he wants to do. Amen. Jesus told the disciples, this kind can only come out by prayer. What does that mean? Do we need to start a playbook for exorcisms and identify spirits and say, well, this kind you do this and that kind you do that? No, I don't think. I think it's a reminder that our faith doesn't entitle or enable us to do anything apart from God, anything apart from the will of God. Prayer, as Jesus spoke here, is by definition communication with God. Making the request, asking God what you want, expressing that we have faith, that he can, and then listening for what he wants to do with it. Justin summed it all up pretty well with a similar statement last week. Do what you think God's telling you to do. This all presumes that we are indeed talking to God and listening for his response. True prayer and true faith both know that the power isn't in us, it's in God. I believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. I think if we're honest, this encapsulates so much of our journey as Christians, our journey to be more like Christ. What we see in the man is he believed, but he knew he didn't believe enough, or he felt, I don't believe enough. He saw his weaknesses. His faith wasn't where he wished it was. But the faith that he had, he was willing to hang it all out there. Put everything on that shred of faith. Even though it almost got him, he didn't let the failure of Jesus' disciples become failure for Jesus in his mind. How many people believe God has let them down because the church let them down? Or because followers of Christ let them down? How many people only have faith when they can see the light at the end of the tunnel or understand how this might work out and kind of see, oh, this is how it's going to work out. This is going to be fine. Okay, now I have faith. This type of faith that needs evidence or a feeling isn't faith at all. Faith that rises and falls with the behavior of a flawed church, full of flawed believers, is also no faith at all. That's why I love the honesty of this man. The disciples have failed. The crowd is arguing, telling him it's a fool's errand. Why are you bothering with this? Obviously, they can't do it. The boy's been sick his whole life. In the face of all the evidence to the contrary, this man hangs it all on the little tiny bit of faith that he has. And then he trusts God for what he doesn't have. He says, this is all I have, I believe. This is all I don't have, help my unbelief. He trusts that God is sufficient. He trusts that Jesus is sufficient for all he doesn't have. Maybe this one we should hang on our walls. A daily reminder that we should risk everything on Jesus, even our unbelief. Let's pray.